It is the Awesemo MLB Live Before Lock show. We are sponsored by JockMKT today, and exciting for me because I get to work with somebody new. Always fun to meet new people, make friends. I was talking to Max right before we started. We went like most of last year without talking to anybody. So hey, it's like new friends I get to meet over the internet. So hey, Max, what's going on?
What's up, man? It's good to be here. Always exciting to talk about baseball when it first starts up. We were talking, we don't have any stats on, but at least we can figure out some leverage plays based on ownership.
Yeah, for sure. And that is definitely going to be something that's interesting to talk about here, in particular with like Matt Moore, who's on the slate today, who didn't pitch at all last year, pitched 10 innings the year before. So basically no data on him. But for the most part, guys who haven't pitched in the league for 2 years, it's probably because they sucked, which is generally what I think is going to be the case with Matt Moore. That's what a lot of the betting numbers indicate also. So yeah, I mean, we could just jump right into this. Also, guys, don't forget, like the YouTube channel, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, like I've been saying all year. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, your player's 33% more likely to hit a home run. It's just good science. So definitely be sure to go check that out. So let's start with some of these pitchers here, Max. And I think where we have to start is on the high end with Jacob Degrom, who is going to be very popular in both FanDuel and DraftKings. For good reason to me. Whenever there's a high-priced pitcher like Degrom, is just in a much better spot than anybody else on the slate. My inclination is just to pay up for him and have him in the majority of my lineups. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm at like 95% Jacob Degrom, and I don't really think anything's going to change. So given the ownership of Degrom, are you going to try to pivot off him at all? Or are you going to try to get above the field? What are you doing with him?
Yeah, I really like his strategy of getting above the field. This is a guy that seems to get better every year, right? Like he's throwing harder and harder. Guys around like 101 in his fastball now. It's ridiculous. And his breaking stuff is insane too. Yeah, I don't see any reason to pivot away from him, especially because we don't have anybody to pivot to, really. When there's a guy like DeGrom and another really high-priced arm that has just as much upside and lower ownership, I can see it. But on a slate like today, just pay up and play the guy.
And the other thing too is, I mean, the other pitching options are so crappy.
Yeah.
Like I think the opportunity cost of just trying to get off the ownership of him, like Carlos Rodon, he's super popular as an SP2, but I mean, there are other guys in the same price range that I think are about comparable, even if they aren't quite as strong of plays as him. Like Jacob Degrom, there's nowhere else to go. The next most expensive pitcher on DraftKings is 8,800. On FanDuel, the next most expensive pitcher is Justice Sheffield at 7,200. So it just puts you on a totally different lineup build than everybody else, but also a better one. Because for me, I mean, there's so much variance in baseball that whenever I have the opportunity to pay up for what I assume to be safe points, I'm going to take it. Because at any point in time, Mike Trout could put up a zero. There's really no slate where Jacob Degrom is going to put up a zero. Like even a bad start for him is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 16 DraftKings points. Yeah. There aren't very many players that could afford you that kind of security. So that's definitely something that I go to. And we have a super chat here from Andrew Kang, our guy right here, always up in the YouTube chat. So we appreciate you. What's up, guys? Greg been on a crazy heater and changed my avatar to Awesemo to a rep. Thanks for the kind congratulatory tweet. Good luck tonight, my man. So Andrew, by the way, Andrew and Gene B. Kim, these two guys, they've been winning everything lately in the YouTube chat. So good to see them watching the show again. So appreciate you, Andrew. What are you making of some of these other pitching options that are on the higher end? Obviously not quite to DeGrom's level, but somebody like Dustin May, who he didn't pitch a whole lot deep into games last year. He's also somebody who, if you just watch him, you would assume looking at his stuff like, oh my God, this guy has to strike out everybody, right? He's throwing like a 98 mile per hour two-seam fastball. It moves a ton. It looks unhittable. But you look at the strikeout numbers and they're generally not really there for him. So what do you make of his potential upside in this matchup? Fairly expensive on DraftKings at 8,800. How deep do you think he's going to work into games? And do you think that he's viable in tournaments?
Yeah, definitely viable. The guy definitely has all the talent that you would want in the world. Like, obviously, you mentioned the fastball, the breaking stuff looks good. And actually, I looked at his spring training numbers, and he was striking out more than a guy in inning, which is something you want to see from May, who, for some reason, people just hit him last year, right? Like, with that kind of stuff, you would expect a lot more swings and misses. Oakland also isn't helping the K's by just looking awful to start the year. So, yeah, I definitely think pairing him with DeGrom is going to be contrarian today, and going with like a cheaper stack, like you mentioned. So yeah, I definitely think May's in play. And I think I wouldn't expect more than 5 innings out of him, but I also wouldn't expect more than 5 innings out of most of these guys. So to start the year, the fact that he doesn't go deep into games isn't as much of a hindrance as it would be in the middle of the year.
Yeah, so here's something I'm kind of struggling with as I'm making my lineups. Is number one, I don't know, like we said, how deep May is going to work into games. I would like to bet on the talent, but just because Degrom is such a high priority for me and he's in over 90% of my lineups, I found it a little hard on DraftKings to fit in lineups with Degrom and May together. Yeah. So I have May in my player pool right now, but I only have him in 9% of my lineups. And it's just for that issue where I'm finding it to be a pricing issue where I can't quite fit both of them in together with some of the offenses I like. Yeah. So I'm just kind of hoping that it's a game where he doesn't make or break the slate. Like if he just goes out and scores, 15 DraftKings points, be like, all right, cool. Fine result isn't going to really impact my lineups. But yeah, I think for him to make the optimal lineup, given how we haven't seen him work too deep into games in general this year, either Degrom would have to suck, which I don't think is all that likely, or just all of the other SP2s are going to suck, which, by the way, is somewhat likely of a scenario because we look at some of these other options. They're bad. I mean, the other guys who are picking up a bunch of ownership on DraftKings, we have Anthony Desclafani, Carlos Rodon, Justice Sheffield. So what is your preferred SP2 option on DraftKings right now?
I am somewhere in between. So I like Rodon, but the fact that he's 50% owned is a little ridiculous for the guy as volatile as he is. To me, like in high stakes, it's almost where I wanna play it as a cash game today, where you just kind of lock in Degrom and Rodon and differentiate yourself in the hitters, because the hitters are just so much more volatile. Like you were saying, Trout can go 0 for 4 at any given point. So for me, that's my preferred way to go in high stakes. If I was making 150 lineups, I would play guys like Waka, like Pavetta, sprinkle those guys in. Even like a Quintana. I know he's facing the Astros, but this guy is somebody who's usually limits damage, gets a bunch of ground balls, strikes a guy out here and there. And I think he will give you leverage over a Rodon who can implode. And Desclafani definitely can implode, especially against the Padres. So yeah, I would play guys like that. And for me, I saw like Frankie Montas is getting a bunch of ownership. I really don't see it against the Dodgers, especially at 8K. Like, why not just drop down 1K and take a guy like even like a Waka or a Pavetta? Feels like they have the same amount of upside at less ownership.
So where I think it really gets tricky with Carlos Rodon in terms of playing, mass entry for me is if you were to ask me what is the lineup, what pair of pitchers do you want to play in cash games? To me, it's very easy. Degrom 1, Carlos Rodon 2. Yeah. But then I start to look at some of his ownership in GPPs, and it has come down a little bit, but he's still projected for over 50% ownership on DraftKings. Even on FanDuel, he's projected to be pretty popular. We only need to roster one pitcher. Rodon's projected for nearly 30% ownership.
Yeah, that's crazy to me.
But like, how much more likely is he to outscore somebody like Michael Wacha, where Waka's projected for 2% ownership and Rodon's projected for 51% ownership? Like, yeah, Rodon, I think, is projected higher, and for good reason. I think that he is more likely to pitch better in terms of fantasy output more often than not. But is he 25 times more likely to outscore Michael Wacha? No, probably not. So I look at that number, and for me right now, I'll just pull up my lineups that I've built right now to give out what the ownership I have on Rodon at the moment. I have him in about 25% of my lineups. And to me, I just think the 51% projected ownership right now is such a high number. So would you be able to reason yourself into going over that 51% number, just given how secure you feel he is relative to the other pitchers, or would you rather be below it?
No, I would definitely be below it if I was playing MME for sure. Like you said, the only way we can really gain leverage when the stats have not normalized themselves yet, with so few games being played, is to play the leverage game with owners. So when a guy is that popular at 50%, going under him and even playing some Mariner stacks is what is definitely makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and that is something that I'm doing, and we'll talk about that when we get to the stack switch. And by the way, the only reason I'm playing Mariner stacks is because of the ownership of Rodon. I don't think individually the Seattle stacks are good points per dollar. They don't even rate out all that well in our top stacks tool. I just like the leverage off of what I view to be an insanely high ownership number on Carlos Rodon.
Yeah.
So then some of the other plays we have here in the lower 7K range, if you had to play one of these guys to be contrarian, Justice Sheffield, Frankie Montas, Michael Wacha, Nick Pavetta. I know you mentioned you don't like Frankie Montas, but if you had to roster somebody who isn't Degrom or Rodon, who would be the guy you go to?
Wacha is definitely my guy. 3% is very enticing as far as ownership goes. Plus, this is like obviously not a lot of data points here, but the Rays are very good with these reclamation pitching projects where they get a guy that struggled somewhere else, they bring him in, they work on this pitch mix, and they get him to perform way better than their baseline. And it doesn't hurt the fact that the Red Sox have just looked dreadful to start the year. And it's not like they have a ton of talent in their lineups anymore. These aren't the Red Sox of old with, Mookie Betts and all these other guys. So yeah, I definitely think Wacha would be my guy if I wanted to pivot off of Rodon.
Yeah, and then, I mean, if we look at some of Wacha's numbers, just pulled up his velocity real quick, is even in the shortened season, he did see an uptick in velocity last year over his 2019 season.
Yeah.
So average fastball velocity of 94 last year. And then let's see if I could find out his max here really quick. But yeah, I mean, we saw him hit up to 98, 99 miles per hour on a few of his fastballs. So the arm talent is there.
Yeah.
So it's not like I agree with you. I mean, overall, I do think Wacha is bad, except I do think there is some hope there, just given that the velocity is still there. It's not like he's a guy who's gone from throwing, 96 miles per hour to like 92 or something like that, where I'd look at him and be like, oh, there's big red flags here that just make it so that he's somebody who is, totally not viable as an MLB pitcher. The velocity is still there. So I think there is reason to think that in a best case scenario, a bounce back happens. At the very least, there's reason to be hopeful when the pitching options are also just total garbage elsewhere on the slate. Are there any pitchers that we have not yet mentioned that you want to bring up?
I brought up Quintana before. Obviously, the matchup is awful, but I do think that he is somebody who's more talented than the $7,400. And the ownership, I think, in our top pitchers tool for him is super low, right?
Yeah. So Jose Quintana,
like 1%, right?
He's only projected for 1% ownership, but he does have a 9% chance to be a top 2 pitcher on the slate. So
yeah, so you're getting leverage there.
Yeah, and that's what so much of baseball is for me also, where nothing's a sure outcome, right? There is no there is no like Jordan McLaughlin starting at mid price at point guard for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And it's like, oh, this guy, we just know he's going to play 35 plus minutes and he's pretty safe to score 20 fantasy points. Like there's nothing like that on MLB. So I'm often just looking at some of the tools we have on the slate, whether it be the top stack tool, the top pitcher tool, and I'm trying to leverage the ownership and saying like, oh, this guy is basically going unowned and we have him with somewhat of a chance to be in the optimal lineup. Like I'll take that chance, and it's only going to pay off 1 out of every 10 slates, given the 9% chance to be in the optimal lineup. But relative to the ownership in the field, that is a good GPP play over the long haul. So I agree with you there. I think that one of the easier ways to differentiate on this slate is to just mix in some of these just basically unowned pitchers that are equally as bad as the ones who are going owned. Like we have Anthony DeSclafani is picking up 23% ownership on this slate. And yes, absolutely. I think Anthony DeSclafani is viable. Our top pitchers tool, we have him as the second most likely pitcher to lead the slate in scoring. But with that said, I mean, like, is Anthony DeSclafani any better than Justice Sheffield or Frankie Montas or Michael Wacha? These guys are all just kind of they're just in the same boat to me.
Yeah, and one guy we didn't talk about was Nick Pavetta, right? Like, he's a guy with all the talent in the world. With Philly, showed flashes, and somebody I've always been a Pavetta truther, to be honest, just because of the stuff, and the strikeout stuff has been so good. So the guy does have a ceiling, and 6.9K, like you said, is he any worse than these other guys that are garnering ownership? No. And our top pitcher tool is projecting him at 3%.
All right, so moving over to the top stacks on the slate, this is also a situation where I think there's a whole lot of leverage to be had. The most popular stack on the slate is the Milwaukee Brewers. They're projected to have 16% ownership as a stack on DraftKings and on FanDuel. They are projected, I had those inversed. It's 16% on FanDuel, 20% on DraftKings, by far the highest number on the slate. So you look at those kind of numbers on a team like Milwaukee. Do you think they are that likely to actually end up being the top scoring team of the day?
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, I would definitely be under on Milwaukee if I was building a bunch of lineups. Yeah, these ownership numbers are like, if you look at our top stacks tool, it's really easy to gain leverage, right? Like we have a leverage column on there to let you know what the best leverage plays are. So yeah, I would definitely be under on Milwaukee. And our top stacks tool tells you exactly the same. They're 9% less likely to be the top stack than their ownership right now.
Yeah, and that's why like my biggest I wouldn't say outright fade, but like right now I have 3% Milwaukee stacks in my lineup build. That is so much less than what the field has. And it's just because I make my lineups and make decisions based on what the difference is between teams actually landing in being the top scoring team on the slate relative to what their ownership is. And I mean, we have the Brewers as being the biggest negative leverage score we've seen of the entire year so far. So I think one of the easiest ways to differentiate if you're playing multiple lineups is go underweight to the field on the Brewers. Or if you're playing one single entry lineup, just play any other stack that isn't the Milwaukee Brewers. The one that I like the most as a contrarian option is the Los Angeles Dodgers. So the Dodgers, we have projected, have the second best odds of being the top scoring team on the slate, also picking up almost no ownership, only 3% projected ownership as a team. And the reason being is because they're really expensive. But I don't really find that inhibiting for this slate, for me, at least when I've been building my lineups, because there's only one expensive pitcher I like in Jacob Degrom. And I mean, there is no other expensive pitcher on the slate anyway. So I mean, there's nobody else to like, even if there was options. But then the other thing also is Jacob Degrom is somebody in the past, we've seen him be a pitcher who's priced $12,000, $13,000. And he's not that price. He's 10,700 on DraftKings. He's 11,000 on FanDuel. So I find it viable to still make Dodgers stacks with Degrom, with a cheap pitcher, and then just throw in some other cheap plugs with the Dodgers to make the lineup work. So I look at the ownership on the Dodgers at 3%, and that's a spot that I really like to get leverage. How do you feel about the Dodgers, and is there maybe another stack that you like as a pivot off of the Brewers?
Yeah, I definitely love the Dodgers, but like you said, especially early in the year, you're going to have some mispricings on some guys that you can fit as those one-offs with the Dodger stack and a Degrom to give you a high leverage lineup. Like if we're looking at, there's some like cheap guys like Tsutsugo's projected for high ownership, but you can fit him with a Dodger stack because the Dodger stack isn't highly owned. So that will still give you a lineup that's capable of taking down a GPP. If I'm looking at other stacks that I like to go from the Dodgers, if we look at our top tool, Houston is projecting at 9%. I like Houston as a stack for sure. But for me, I think I like the Cubbies are projecting at 10%. I did not think that they would be as popular. I definitely like a Cubby stack a lot here. And doesn't hurt that the wind is blowing out in Wrigley. And that's always a good spot to be in.
Yeah. You know, it's funny with the Cubs and the Brewers is there is a little bit of win there, but I think it's being overrated a little bit, at least by the field right here, to the point where, I mean, the Brewers and the Cubs are combined to pick up 30% ownership on the slate. And if you look at the Vegas totals, it's not like the implied run totals for these teams is massive or anything. The game has an over under of 9.5. You know, we've seen other Cubs games where, you know, the total gets massively high, like Rays Red Sox, that is a 9.5 total. Angels Astros, that game has a 10 total. So it's not like we're expecting there to be a mass amount of runs scored in this game. And one of the reasons also is even though the wind's blowing out, it's not significant. And also Wrigley Field was redone last year to somewhat mitigate the effects of the wind. It's still going to matter, but I don't think that slight wind blowing out has a massive impact on this game. And I think that's kind of reflected in the total here. So like, I'm going to, go ahead.
Another thing I like to look at here is who is pitching, right? So Brett Anderson is a ground ball pitcher, 57% ground balls last year. So if you're not going to be able to get in the air, the wind's not going to matter for you.
Yeah, and then there's just the point that these teams are both really popular. If I had to roster the Cubs or the Brewers, I'd be more inclined to roster the Cubs just because I think the Brewers are going so overowned. But the Cubs aren't going to be one of my most popular stacks for me on the slate. We did get a question here about the Mets as a potential stack. We have Ryan Rennebaum in the YouTube chat asked, what are our thoughts on a full Mets stack in large field GPPs on DraftKings? So I have a little bit different of a take on this now than I did earlier. The reason being is we didn't have a projection for Matt Moore earlier in the day, and that was messing with some of the numbers from the Mets. But now that we have Matt Moore in there, and I think the projection system just kind of recognized that Matt Moore is garbage, the Mets now have an 8% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate, which is a slightly positive leverage score. So the Mets who were early in the day weren't projecting out all that well. Now I think that we can consider them to be a pretty good stack given what some of the numbers we have here. What are you expecting from Matt Moore here? Because he has basically not pitched at all in 2 years.
Yeah, you never know, right? Like, he's always given up a ton of hard contact. He's had some decent strikeout stuff through the years, but he tends to leave his pitches in the middle of the zone and they get hit hard. The Mets are only projected for 4.5 runs, which I feel like is low, right? So that should lower their ownership as well, where people are going to gravitate to the really high totals on the slate. So I do think you're getting some leverage of playing a Mets stack. Just looking at their starting lineup, you have some real lefty mashers in here. JD Davis just destroys left-handed pitching. Pilar is only 3.4K leading off. Not a lot of power, but definitely hits lefties better than he does righties. I don't have any issues with a Mets stack here.
Yeah, and also to me, that was something that was a really big positive, is that we got the Mets lineup just as we were starting. Kevin Pillar is leading off, and that matters to me. I think that somebody who's that cheap on both FanDuel and DraftKings in a premier lineup spot against what we presume is going to be a really garbage pitcher in Matt Moore. Yeah. I mean, we haven't seen him pitch in a couple of years, but he didn't stop pitching because everybody was lining up to sign him. Matt Moore was like, no, I'm just going to hold. Like, there just wasn't interest in him pitching because he's been bad for a while. So I mean, he had an ERA of nearly 7 the last time we saw him active in the big leagues. So I'm going to assume he's going to be bad again this year when he's on the field. And then somebody else I'm going to point out, JD Davis, who's only 2,400 on FanDuel. That's a really cheap price tag and definitely makes him one of the better value plays on the slate. So go ahead.
What I remember, he was kind of like a reverse splits guy where lefties hit him just as hard as righties. I'm just going to look it up real quick. I know these are like 2 years ago stats, but that's all we have on the guy. So we kind of have to go with it.
Yeah, that's something else that's a little wonky about this year is, so for last year, especially if guys were hurt last season, right? Like there could be guys we only saw get, like 40 to 50 plate appearances. And then you have to go back 2 years to find actual data on them. And then some guys who just had such outlier seasons, like Pete Alonso, we could talk about him for a second on the Mets. I have no clue what to expect from Pete Alonso this year because he was so good, arguably the best power hitting rookie we've ever seen in baseball his first year in the league. Then last year, he just kind of sucked. And so I kind of assume this year he's probably going to be somewhere in between for his third season. But the matchup against Matt Moore couldn't really get any better. Also, Mets' first game of the season because of COVID canceling the first few games of the season. So somebody like Pete Alonso, what are you expecting from him?
Yeah, I actually think I wrote him up as one of the home run leaders for NL. Just a guy that has immense power. For whatever reason, didn't show it last year. But it's not like that's going to disappear. So yeah, I absolutely love Pete Alonso in the spot. And if you do want to differentiate your stacks, like I said, don't be afraid to play guys that are lefty, like Conforto going up against Matt Moore. First of all, you don't know how long Moore's even going to be in there. Being a 2-year layoff and not being very good, you could get the bullpen real quick. And people, when they stack against left-handed pitchers, try to get all these righties in there. And sometimes you get a little bit of leverage by going with some good left-handed hitters.
All right. And then just one other stack I really want to bring up. I mentioned it before when we talked about Carlos Rodon. The Mariners do not rate out well in our top stacks tool at all, but I'm still getting to them just based on the ownership of Rodon. So I think that with Rodon being over 50% owned, if I'm going to be underweight to the field on Rodon, I better have some Mariner stacks the way that I play GBPs because or else like something has to give, right? Like there isn't really a scenario where Rodon has a bad game and the Mariners have a bad game, at least most likely. The odds are, given that the Mariners are cheap, given that Rodon's cheap, one side of that game is going to have to go, fairly decently from a value perspective. So I have about 10% Mariner stacks right now, which fairly heavy relative to the field. So how do you feel about the Mariners as a stack? And do you think there's a better way to get leverage off of Rodon than stacking up the Mariners?
No, there definitely isn't. I mean, when the guy is 50% owned, you want to stack some of your teams against him to get that leverage. I am surprised to see that they're projected for 7.6%, just I guess because they're so cheap. and that's one of the higher percentages in our top stacks tool. I would have expected them to be a lot less, like kind of like a 1% stack. But yeah, if I would go over the 7.6% field ownership percentage on Seattle, especially if I was playing less Rodon.
Yeah, so the other thing here that I think also drives up their ownership a little bit is, so even though we only have them with a 4% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate, which is the third lowest, we do them with a 12% chance to be the top value stack on the slate. So we are looking at them as the second best stack on the slate in terms of a points per dollar perspective. So that does make them look a little bit more favorable from that angle. But to me, I mean, the reason I want to roster them is just because of the leverage off of Rodon. And I tend to think that Rodon being this popular, I'm not sure I even buy that the Mariners are going to be quite that popular as a stack. I think that there will be some one-offs here and there. Like, I think Mitch Haniger is a really strong play on both FanDuel and DraftKings. 3,200 for Haniger on DK with minimal ownership is definitely somebody I want to get to. I think that if you're not comfortable with 5-man stacks, I definitely think at the very least throwing in, like 1 or 2 Mariners players in lineups that don't have Rodon, something else that makes sense to me. So, by the way, if anybody has questions, throw those in. But while I'm looking for those, Max, are there any other stacks that we haven't talked about that are of interest to you?
Yeah. Before I get to that, let me just go with your 5-man stacking point. If you are stacking against a guy like Rodon, who's super popular, I would go 5-man stacks though. Just because when the guy implodes like Rodon, he tends to walk a lot of guys. So you're going to get a bunch more at-bats for the guys in the order and potentially a lot more runs scored, turning over the lineup. So I would definitely look at one-offs less against him and stacks more so.
And then one thing real quick here, because Tony Porcello, he has asked a question here. He's saying, Degrom and Rodon, is that the way to go single entry GPP, or would you rather be on somebody else than Rodon at 50%? By the way, in single entry, I would assume that number on Rodon is going to be higher than 50%. But who would you pair with Degrom if you were just playing one single entry lineup?
I would go with Waka, like we were saying. It is nice to get that leverage and hopefully eliminate 60% of teams and just go against the rest if Rodon does have a bad game. Like you said, in head-to-heads and in double-ups, it doesn't really make sense to go anywhere but Rodon. You just kind of want to use your leverage somewhere else. But in single-entry GPPs, I think it's a different story.
All right, guys, today's show is sponsored by JockMKT. What is JockMKT? So this is just a different way to play DFS. So instead of building lineups with any kind of salary constraints or anything like that, we're basically investing in players as if they are stocks. So there's an IPO period, and we're bidding on those players. Then depending on where they finish in terms of total points at the end of the night, that's how much return you get based on whatever you bought these players at their IPO price. Also, if you want to get involved in JockMKT, you can play for free. Just go download JockMKT in the App Store for whatever phone you use. And if you do want to make a deposit, use the promo code Awesemo50, and that will give you a $50 bonus on your first deposit. And you only have to make a deposit of up to $20 to be able to get back that $50 deposit. So definitely a good bonus to take advantage of. And then also JockMKT, just a fun, different way to play DFS and get a little bit of diversity. Invest in DFS a different way. I know that on Thursdays I've been doing JockMKT shows with Eric Lindquist, and we've been having a lot of fun doing those. And people outbid us in the YouTube chat as we go along. So always fun. Download that and check that out. All right, so let's get into some of the positions now. So starting with the catcher position, who are the catchers that you are prioritizing on this slate?
So let me just pull it up in our projections because I like to use that and just go by salary there. While I'm doing that, I did want to bring up another stack because I kind of went off subject there a little bit. I think San Diego gives you good leverage against Desclafani, another expensive stack, but somebody that I would use on the slate to get the leverage against a way over-owned Desclafani, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Desclafani right now is projected to be the third highest owned pitcher on the slate. Number 1 being Degrom, 2 Rodon, 3 Desclafani, and then it's kind of everybody else coming in behind him. So that is all sensible. So I'll start talking about the catchers. The guy who right now I have the most exposure to in my player pool is Tommy Murphy. And there is a couple of reasons for that. Number 1, he's cheap at only $2,500. It's very difficult to get to really get any production from the catcher position as is. So unless there's somebody who, like Salvador Perez, who's in a really prime spot, catcher's a position I like to punt more often than not. And then also just talking about the really high ownership projection for Carlos Rodon, I think one of the better one-off options is Tommy Murphy, just given his price and some leverage there. So which catchers are you honing in on?
Yeah, Tommy Murphy projected at 26% in our ownership projections, which is interesting to me considering if 50% are going to play Rodon, you wouldn't think that many people are playing a catcher against their pitcher, but you never know with such a small slate. Yeah, Tommy Murphy, definitely a lot of upside, right? Like a big power guy, really only need one home run, and he's probably going to be your top scoring catcher. Contreras is another guy, 4,900, pretty expensive, but playing for the Cubbies against another lefty and Brett Anderson at 21% owned, probably a little too high, but I would rank him as the highest projected catcher today, right? And then the other guys that are catching my eye here is James McCann against Matt Moore. Only 3,700 feels a little cheap for a guy that has smashed lefties in his career, and only projected at 9%, which is something that I would look forward to. And then Mercedes is the guy that's everybody's been talking about in his first couple of games for the White Sox, has been smashing against Sheffield, 11.6% owned, feels a little bit under where I would be, and he's only 3K.
Yeah. So the other thing, I mean, we talk about the impressive start that Shohei Ohtani had yesterday. Maybe the most impressive thing he did was not striking out hitters. It was not throwing over 100 miles per hour. It wasn't hitting a homer on the first pitch he saw of the game. It was that he got Yermin Mercedes out because nobody was able to get him out. Yeah. He had a stretch. I think it was like 8 plate appearances in a row that he reached base in. If you look at his DraftKings points, opening day, 27 DraftKings points. Then the second game of the season, 24. And then he was held hitless yesterday. But yeah, I mean, given that his price is not yet adjusted and the fact that he appears to be a catcher who's capable of hitting, definitely somebody that I think warrants being on. And then I totally agree with you on James McCann. He is my second most owned catcher behind Tommy Murphy right now. So with McCann, it's just like you said, what we view as a favorable matchup against Matt Moore, a guy who's historically hit left-handed pitching really well. So all of that lines up to James McCann being a catcher that I definitely have interest in. Moving over to first base, somebody who is going to be one of the most popular hitters on the slate, especially now that we have the Rays lineup, Yoshi Tsutsugo, who is going to be leading off for them. Very cheap on both FanDuel and DraftKings. I'm going to be underweight to the field on Rays stacks, but as an individual one-off play, I think I'm going to be pretty high on Tsutsugo. He's one of my higher owned hitters right now. So what do you make of Tsutsugo, and do you think his ownership is a little bit too high? Are you willing to go there anyway because of the price?
Yeah, 30% is high on any hitter, right? Like 2,900 is great and helps you save some money. But yeah, the ownership is a little high on him. I can definitely see him as the optimal play, right? Like somebody you would put into cash games. As far as GPP goes, I would probably go under the field there just because any 30% hitter is somebody that you should be under in GPPs, since getting leverage on a hitter is so much easier than on a pitcher with their projections. I like Keston Hiura actually here. First base eligible on DraftKings and in a good spot here against Williams. Actually hit him, it's a small sample obviously, but has 3 home runs against him in his career, which is crazy because I feel like he's only been in the league for a few years. So that's another guy I would play here. And we already talked about Pete Alonso, but I feel like between him and McCann, Met stacks look really, really juicy. Looking at just how the ownership numbers line up with the Mets and who they're facing.
Yeah, I think the thing with Pete Alonso, we talked about a little bit before, is, just what kind of player are we getting here? Because he's a guy, is it the guy who was hitting, 50 plus home runs the first year he was in the league? Or is it the guy who just really struggled last year? I tend to think we get more of the first year player than the second year player from Pete Alonso. And the other thing that's important here, he's starting the year with a really favorable price tag, a really favorable matchup, like 4,800. Pete Alonso is somebody who was pretty regularly, even to start last year when he was struggling, somebody who was over 5,000. So I will buy the price dip on him. Any other first basemen that you think are worth getting an appreciable amount of exposure to?
Yeah, you talked about having more Seattle stacks than the average, and I'm assuming you're getting Evan White quite a bit. Only 2,600, and definitely a lot of power. Somebody that can take road down deep.
Yeah, so I'm looking through my first base exposure right now. In the build I have, Evan White is my fourth most owned first baseman. So definitely relative to the field, he's somebody that I'm over on. So I like him. Jared Walsh is super popular for cash games, though. I'd still get to him on both FanDuel and DraftKings. I have him in my player pool, but I'm underweight to him in tournaments. But as just an individual value play, I think Jared Walsh is really strong.
Yeah, what he hit like 2 home runs yesterday. Did he hit the game winner? I think he did for the Angels.
Yeah, he hit a walk-off 3-run homer.
Yeah. 3,900 feels way too cheap. Cronenworth is another guy against Desclafani. Another leverage play since Desclafani is supposed to be popular. 3,400. And from what I remember, Desclafani struggles against southpaws more so than right-handers. So you're getting a good spot there.
Yeah, and then Cronenworth also second base eligible. One thing that is, and by the way, FanDuel also now has players with multi-positional eligibility. The one thing that is a little tricky talking about, like position by position, is like Cronenworth. I had him tagged as one of my favorite second base plays, but obviously
usually you would want him at second base because he has power, and more first basemen have power than second basemen, right? So you want to get as much power into your lineup as possible to maximize your score. But here, just because like Tsutsugo is your 30% guy, but does he really have that much power? Not really. So Cronenworth is somebody, if you love somebody at second base, you can definitely fit him in at first base as well.
Yeah, and then so Cronenworth was somebody who I definitely wanted to mention at second base. Somebody else, Brandon Lau, who is much cheaper on FanDuel than he is on DraftKings. Actually, one of the cheaper starting second basemen on FanDuel. So with that considered, Brandon Lau, who is actually for a large stretch of time last year, he's one of the favorites to win the AL MVP, at least based on betting odds to the first, half of the season or so. He trailed off a little bit towards the second half, but still, I think Lau is opening up the season much too cheaply priced on FanDuel. DraftKings, the price is about right at 4,800, but that FanDuel price definitely stands out to me. Somebody else who I'm getting to a decent amount at second base is Gavin Lux. He's off to a good start this year. And the other thing, too, is if you look at our top stacks tool, the Dodgers are one of the most under-owned teams on the slate. But something else I mentioned before about the Dodgers, they are also really expensive. So it is hard to just go and stack up the 5 most expensive Dodgers bats. Like I need to mix in some of the other guys like, Chris Taylor at 4,200, also with second base eligibility. Gavin Lux, who's 4,000 with second base eligibility. So these are a couple of cheaper Dodgers guys that have second base eligibility that I am fitting in to just kind of make those lineups work with Jacob Degrom. How do you feel about Gavin Lux, and what do you expect from him this year?
Yeah, power speed combination, right? Steal some bases, which is always nice to have that upside. 4K is definitely expensive for who he was as a hitter last year, but I think this year he's been much better. And it gives you exposure to a lineup that hopefully turns over a bunch, and he gives you more at-bats. And only projected at 0.3%. I'm sure that'll update at some point, but I still projected way under the other guys. And I think it gives you some good leverage. Our top 2 projected second basemen are Hiura and Wong, who play for the same team. So I really like going somewhere other than the Brewers there. Another guy is Ty France. I know you mentioned him earlier as far as Seattle stacks. Another guy that's 3,800 that you can play against Rodon as leverage. And I'm not sure, is McNeil in the lineup today? Let me see. McNeil is playing against Moore. And like I said, if you want to build a lower owned Mets stack, don't mind getting some lefties there against the lefty. Wrong side of the platoon, but you never know how long Moore's going to be in there.
Yeah, McNeil batting 6, so pretty good lineup spot against Matt Moore.
Yeah.
And also, McNeil hit lefties extremely well last year.
He did, yeah.
Off the top of my head, I think he had something like a 130 WRC plus against lefties. But yeah, I mean, he's not like some guy with massive platoon splits, and he's also one of the more underrated hitters in baseball. Like I remember when the Mets first traded for Robinson Cano, I was thinking like, well, McNeil's better. Like McNeil, if you look at McNeil's recent hitting numbers, he's been really successful. So, I think he is definitely, if you want to go for a lower owned second baseman. And yeah, I totally agree with what you said there also, where not too concerned about the left on left matchup. Any other second baseman here that are worth talking about to you?
Yeah, I don't really see anybody else. Like Fletcher just doesn't have too much power there. Yeah, and I'm really getting more and more on Waka, so I'm not that interested in Kike Hernandez either.
All right, guys, and don't forget, do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like I've said all year, if you subscribe to the channel, players 33% more likely to homer, pitchers more likely to get strikeouts. Definitely. Why do you think Andrew Kang won GPP the other day? Was it because he built good lineups? No, it's just because he subscribed to the YouTube channel and no other reason whatsoever. So help us help you. Subscribe to our channel. Let's move on to the next position. Third base. We just talked about second base. Yeah, I had to pull up the sheet really quick to see what did I submit to producer Chris and tell him we're going to talk about after second base. So, all right, third baseman here. The third baseman that I have the most exposure to right now is Alex Bregman. It's a position that I'm overall pretty even with across the board. There's no one guy that I have a massive amount of exposure to. But earlier I was talking about how a couple of teams I think really stand out as good pivots off of the Milwaukee Brewers, just super chalky stack. One of them is the Dodgers. One of them is the Astros. So the two third basemen I'm getting to the most are Alex Bregman and Justin Turner. Is there any real value you see here? Because this is a position I'm mostly paying up for.
Yeah, I really don't see any reason to pay down here, just because the guys that are expensive are expensive for a reason. They're really, really good. So if a couple of those guys hit home runs, you're gonna have a hard time catching up with the lower price guys. So I don't see any reason to pay down here, especially with the projections liking Chris Bryant, Rondon, Bregman, like you said. Shaw seems to be chalky at 4,300. I guess the only guy I see here that's projected as low owned but also expensive that we haven't talked about is Manny Machado. Obviously, all the talent in the world can really destroy any slate and make himself the guy that you need to have to win GPPs.
Yeah, I'm just going through my exposures right now. The only player that I'm getting to that isn't one of the expensive third basemen right now is I have about 10% exposure to Luis Urias, $2,700. So he's kind of in a price range by himself at the third base position. He also has shortstop eligibility, but I think one of the main reasons I'm getting to him is it just looks like when I'm building lineups in Fantasy Cruncher and the builder's just kind of sometimes getting at spots where it's like, hey, we need a roster cheap third baseman here. And Urias is the only guy that I'm really getting to there, or else this is a position I'm largely paying up for.
Yeah. I mean, if you're playing Degrom and you're playing the Dodger stack, you kind of have to play Urias, right? Just because you have to pay down somewhere.
Yeah, so I don't think you have to, but he's one of the options. Like the guys who, so I don't mind the ownership on highly owned hitters if I already have a contrarian stack. So many of those Dodgers guys are going so low owned.
Yeah.
Like I don't mind having, like a 30% owned Setsugo in that lineup because he's what helps me save salary to get to those bats. And it's not like it's a lineup that's likely to be duped because the overall, the ownership is so low on the Dodgers. We're talking about a stack that's only projected for 3% ownership. So with that in mind, like any Dodger stack is going to be fairly unique. And I don't mind mixing in some of the more chalky hitters into those lineups. Or if I just have one of the more contrarian pitchers, right? Like we talked about like Michael Wacha a lot. If I have Michael Wacha 2% owned, I have a Dodger stack at 3% owned. Like that's just a unique lineup by itself. It doesn't really matter what else is chalk.
Yeah, and if you are playing a Dodger stack, like I like to skip Turner in my Dodger stacks just because his power upside is less so than other guys in that stack, and you're just kind of trying to get as many power hitters as possible. So I did find myself skipping Turner a lot and going cheaper at third base.
All right. Any other third baseman here that you would like to talk about? If not, we can move on to the shortstops.
Yeah, I always like to talk about Flores when it comes to third base and him facing a lefty, just because the guy just has such crazy platoon splits. And he's only 3,700.
Yeah, I think the one thing though that I struggle a little bit, and by the way, some people in the YouTube chat were talking about Morajan. So Morajan never completed more than four. He never worked into the fifth inning last year. I think his deepest start of the year was he got 10 outs. So I don't think he's going to work very deep into the game, and I'm just a little concerned that Flores, number one, he's a pinch hit risk, but then
Yeah,
number two, the Padres have a really good bullpen. And I'm a
they do.
little wary of Morajan coming out of the game, and then they're just facing really good bullpen pitchers. Who, number one, Flores is probably only going to get one or two at bats against a lefty. So that is something that has me maybe a little bit different on Flores than you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just looking at the different matchups here. Yeah, I definitely see those points of Flores, but when you're rostering a guy, like I really try not to think about pinch hit risk too much, just because there's so much volatility in every hitter. And thinking about that just kind of deflates the points that do go for him. Morajan did give up a bunch of hard hit balls last year. So hopefully Flores just gets that home run, and then you don't even have to worry about the pinch hit already because he's paid it up for you.
Yeah, well, for sure, if he homers in his first at bat, then everything else does matter. He could come out of the game he could get hurt rounding the bases, and he has a good game at that point. It doesn't matter. So moving over to the shortstops, the most popular shortstop play on the slate on DraftKings is by far Fernando Tatis Jr., project for over 20% ownership. Also very popular at 5,800. So what are you doing with Tatis on this slate?
It's hard to get him because I like the Dodgers so much and I like Degrom so much. So for me, it's been tough to get Tatis just because of his price. And I don't know if 5,800 just feels like he has to destroy the slate completely in order to pay off that salary. And there's other guys that are a little bit cheaper that do have some upside. Just because I like the Dodgers and somewhat the Astros, I've been landing on Urias a lot. I know we talked about him at third base, but he's the guy you definitely want to look at if you're paying down at shortstop. Javi Baez is another guy that has the same upside, I would say, as Tatis Jr. does, but is going about half as much ownership as Tatis.
So for me, my priority play at shortstop is Francisco Lindor. I think that he warrants having about the same price tag as Fernando Tatis, but $1,000 cheaper. So Lindor at 4,800, Tatis at 5,800. I know neither one of us think that DeSclafani is a world beater, but I still think DeSclafani is better than Matt Moore. And Francisco Lindor, I think he should have a really strong season with the Mets this year. He has a lot of talent around him that should help with his counting stats. So 4,800 for Francisco Lindor in this kind of matchup. Also, Mets debut. Not that that really matters to me in terms of production, but I still think that he's just going way underpriced relative to what we've seen from him in the past. I'm going to bring up some of his pricing really quick, but for most of last year, he was priced over 5,000, kind of like the low to mid 5,000 range. So I'm starting at 4,800 in a plus matchup. Definitely something I have interest in. So Lindor, definitely a priority play for me. Other than that, I think we've hit on most of the shortstops that I have interest in. Anybody else that you think warrants discussion?
Yeah, no, just going back to Lindor, I feel like we've hit on every Mets player so far. So I guess we definitely do love that stack. The only guy is Correa, just all the upside in the world with him as well. 4,700 feels like too cheap.
All right. So moving on now to the outfielders, and we got a bunch of pay up options here, as per usual at the outfield position. But if you could only pay up for one outfielder on the slate, Christian Yelich, Mike Trout, maybe somebody else, who would it be for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always Trout for me, right? Like, he's just so much more talented than pretty much every other hitter, just a perennial MVP guy that just destroys baseballs. So if you're paying up, just go all the way up and take Trout. Like Yelich had a down year last year. I do expect him to bounce back this year, but kind of showed less power last year, hit a lot more balls on the ground, not what you want to see out of a 5,500 guy.
Yeah, and I mean, that's reasonable also. I mean, Mike Trout, Christian Yelich, both of them are expensive and popular. Like Yelich is in my player pool. He's nearly 40% owned though. And by no means do I think Yelich is a bad play. I have him in my lineup in the teens right now in terms of exposure, but for a hitter that's that expensive, it is really hard for me to get to him at around the 40% number. So There's other guys I'd rather get to. Like I have Mike Trout and Christian Yelich in my lineup about the same amount. I have Mookie Betts there. Mookie Betts only 6% projected ownership. Cody Bellinger, 5% projected ownership. Like I don't think that Yelich is 10x more likely to hit a home run than Mookie Betts or Cody Bellinger this late, but yet he's about 10x what their ownership is. And that just makes it hard for me to get to Christian Yelich at 5,500 at 40% on quite as much as the field does. So that's how I feel about Yelich. What's a number that you would feel like comfortable having him in the lineups? Like knowing that he's that popular and he's a hitter obviously with a lot of upside, but also there's variance there. Would you leave him out of your player pool entirely or just be underweight to the field?
Yeah, depends on how many lineups you're making, right? But for me, as a guy that doesn't make a lot of lineups, I would just go completely X him out, just because 40% is insane. And I think you hit on the point earlier that people are over projecting the wind at Wrigley today, where it doesn't matter as much as it has in previous years, and it's not even blowing out that hard out. And it's really scary that he hit that many ground balls last year. Where this is a guy that is usually pretty swing plane conscious and tries to have a little bit of an uppercut swing to get as much power under the ball as he can, and definitely didn't show it last year. So having Trout half as owned as him, I would definitely flip that.
Yeah, and I mean I'm just kind of flat on the guys at the top. I just have, like I said, Betts, Trout, Yelich, Bellinger. I have all these guys owned in the teens, which basically just has me like way underweight to the field on Yelich relative to where they're at on him, and then just overweight to the Dodgers guys. Some other outfielders that are popping up for me a lot right now. Jake Marisnick, just really as a price point play. I'm assuming that's why he's coming up so much. But I mean, 2,600 for Jake Marisnick, batting 7th for the Cubs. A guy who's hit left-handed pitching much better than right-handed pitching in the past. Also a fairly favorable matchup today. So Jake Marisnick, somebody, even though we said that we don't think the win matters too much at Wrigley, the price point to me is favorable, and then kind of similar feels on somebody like Ian Happ, who's leading off at 4,600. Two guys that I'm definitely getting to at a higher clip than the field right now. So other hitters, which outfielders are you really honing in on?
Yeah, just going with our Mets team. Don't forget about Michael Conforto. Also hits lefties pretty good. So not worried about that with Mike Moore. Just other guys. I really like your Dodger plays with Bellinger and Betts, just because people are not going to get to those guys at their price points. I think you also mentioned Haniger earlier in the show. That's another guy I would definitely put into my Seattle stacks if you want to fade the leverage and get some leverage on Rodon.
Haniger, somebody I'm pretty high on. Other cheap bets, let's see who's popping up from Miles Straw, who we don't have in a lineup yet for the Astros. Let me just check to make sure that hasn't come out. Doesn't look like it has, but Miles Straw, a guy who has a ton of speed upside. Also, Astros, another team that's coming up pretty under-owned in our top stacks tool. So Miles Straw, somebody who there's a bunch of expensive bats in the Astros lineup. If I'm looking to get to somebody who's a little bit cheaper, Miles Straw, only 2,500. Potential to steal a couple bases. I expect he's going to be in the lineup, especially because it looks like Michael Brantley is going to be out for another day or two. So Miles Straw, somebody else I'm getting to. Just a few minutes left here. So let's say give out one more outfield play that you're pretty high on, and then we'll do like a summary of the slate before signing off.
Yeah, I like Kiermaier as well, only 3K. In Boston with that pesky pole, you really don't have to hit it that far. Don't pull it out. Don't have to pull it that far as a lefty to get a cheap home run.
All right. So now let's go over. Let's go top pitcher on the slate. Then we'll go top stack, and then we'll do a home run call. So top pitcher, pretty clear cut. Jacob Degrom. I don't think there's any way you could reason anybody else. But who do you think is the second most likely pitcher to end up optimal outside of Degrom?
Yeah, I guess let's go Waka, just because we've been talking about him and he gives you really good leverage on Rodon. But Rodon is definitely the optimal guy to pair with DeGrom for your cash games.
Yeah, I agree with that. Relative to ownership, I'd say cash games go DeGrom on FanDuel. On DraftKings, I'd say go DeGrom and Rodon for GPPs. DeGrom and Waka, I think, is a pretty strong combination. I mean, Waka, even if you're playing 20 lineups, if you build 2 of them with Wacha, you are 5x the field on Michael Wacha at his current projected ownership.
Yeah.
So not hard to get over the field on Wacha. Stacks, my favorite stack on the slate relative to what the ownership is, it's the Los Angeles Dodgers. They're very popular. I mean, they're very expensive. They're not very popular. But given that we have them with about as good of odds of landing in the optimal lineup as any other team on the slate, we have a bunch of teams that are really close. Astros 11%, Dodgers 11%, Brewers 11%, Rays 10%, Angels 9%. But still, you look at these teams, all of those teams are picking up ownership other than the Dodgers. Dodgers only 3% projected ownership right now. So that is my priority stack in GPPs. For you, which is the team that you were looking to get to the most as a stack?
Yeah, I'll go Padres. Also an expensive stack, but definitely gives you leverage on Desclafani, who's supposed to be the third highest projected pitcher as far as ownership goes today. And I mean, their lineup is full of all-stars. It's just murderer's row, just as good as the Dodgers, I think.
All right, home run call. I'm going to go with Pete Alonso. Max, who's going to hit a home run tonight? Or better yet, who's going to hit 3 home runs tonight? And that'll close us out.
I'm going to go Lindor in his debut as a Met, paying off that insane salary.
All right, I like it. So I've got Alonso, you've got Lindor. So hopefully they both homer, and the Mets stacks are going to be looking pretty good. Guys, if you haven't done it already, please hit the like button. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you do, both Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor guaranteed to have multiple home run games. So also want to get in on that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. So that'll do it for us. Guys, if you have any questions, you could follow me on Twitter at Ehrenberg Dfs. Max, what is your Twitter handle?
DFS Max.
All right, so follow Max also, and I'm sure bother him with questions as well. I'm sure that he will happily get back to you. And that'll do it for us today, guys.
Yep. Sounds good. Have a good one, guys.